All right, I'm Sean Kennedy, and I would like to talk about the transportation industry, specifically about alternative fuel vehicles. And I'd like to, it is a fact that currently alternative fuel vehicles are already viable alternatives to fossil fuel vehicles. And I'd like to, the 3 points that I'd like to make about this, I'm going to start with talking about fossil fuel vehicles themselves. Then I'm going to talk about electric cars, and then I'm going to talk about hydrogen fuel cell cars. And throughout this argument, I'm going to be using the word viability, and I'm defining viability for this as the overall competitive nature and comparative metrics of a car, such as fuel economy, pricing, and the environmental impact of that type of vehicle on the road. So anyway, fossil fuels themselves, I mean, we all know what I mean by fossil fuels. That could be anything from gasoline to charcoal to basically just anything found in nature that we use to burn or produce energy from. And for basically, for all of our existence, fossil fuels have been the reliable go-to source of energy that we use to fuel our world and our society. And the reason it's been that way is because it's been accessible, easy, and basically we just developed using that, and so it's the simplest method for everyday individual use. However, ever since the Industrial Revolution and the upturn of the use of these fossil fuels and the impact on our environment that they have had, along with the fact that we are now, through research and through the dwindling amounts of these resources that we're finding, we're beginning to understand the fact that this is not an infinite resource, and we are actually quite abruptly coming up on likely a projected end towards the upper limit of how much of those resources we're going to find, which puts into question the actual viability going forward of fossil fuels as our driving force of energy. So anyway, like I said, a recent, I think it was 2016, so about two, 3 years ago, a company in England called Ecotricity, which is a energy producing and research group, found in their study that in totality, all fossil fuels that we currently know about are projected to be to run out by 2088. Of course, that's just a projection, and it's likely that I think they gave a buffer of 10 years, give or take, to that number. But it's less important the fact that we have a date that it's supposed to run out. It's more important that we talk about how we can start trying to avoid that and start working with other forms of energy, such as electricity or whatever else. It's also a well-known fact, I'm pretty sure all of us are aware of the fact that global warming is 100% a truth that is happening. There's hundreds of studies by hundreds of groups. One study that I looked at that was actually from a NASA climate study showed that since the Industrial Revolution, I believe it was, the average temperature globally has risen by 0.8 degrees Celsius, and even in certain areas it has risen by as much as 2.5 degrees Celsius. And on top of that, in another by 2050, we're projected to increase by another degree. It all doesn't sound like a lot, but it's actually extremely damaging to the planet. And I mean, we see all the news coverage about the melting ice caps and things like that. So it doesn't sound like a lot, but it's actually extremely damaging, to the point that even a Dr. Thomas Crowther of a completely different study has said that we are already beyond the point of no return since the Industrial Revolution, which means that at this point we will not be able to go back to pre-Industrial Revolution amounts of CO2 in the air and or the average temperature at that time. So anyway, that's the basic rundown of fossil fuels, and I'd like to talk about electric cars right now. Electric cars are already a viable option on the market. We all know about Tesla, we all know about how Toyota, Honda, all these long-term car companies have already started creating electric alternatives, which is very helpful, really great to the point, it's really awesome. And the reason for that is because electrics actually offer a lot of benefits, and the reality is not a lot of downsides that can't be solved within a few more years of research and development. For instance, electric cars actually use about 75% of they're 75% energy efficient, which means of the energy we put into them, they use about 75% of that on average. Against the 15% that fossil fuel vehicles use on average. So it's much more energy efficient, and those numbers come from a company called Clean Technica. Electrics are also very similar. It's very easy to transition into electrics. They operate the same way. They feel the same way. The only difference is you can just plug it in at night, charge your car up, and then you don't have to worry about it for the rest of the day. So it's already a very user-friendly and easy to transition to type of vehicle. And then on top of that, we can use the same, if we wanted to try and push for a larger incorporation of electric vehicles in our modern day, we can already use the existing infrastructure of the power grid that we have already set up to all gas stations. We already have power going everywhere, so it's not a difficult thing to just sort of make minor changes here and there to allow for easier access for electric vehicles. And yes, a brief note, it is a producer of CO2 emissions and other damaging things for the environment to produce electricity. However, a lot of scientists and all sorts of different studies say that if we can get to a net negative, which means the majority of self-driving is done on electric cars, and with further development of the production of electricity, that negative should basically just go away with time. And then on to hydrogen fuel cells. Hydrogen fuel cells are comparable more so to fossil fuels than electrics. They're still heavily in development. They're sort of a newcomer on the scene. I believe currently there are only 3 market-prepared hydrogen fuel cell vehicles that are open to the public that you can drive on regular roads. And then there's also only, I think, it was something like 50 hydrogen fueling stations, all of which are only here in California, which means on the greater scale, they're currently not technically viable, though, again, with further development, with further time, with further commitment to them, they could be extremely useful. They're extremely similar to regular gasoline cars. You just pull up to a gas station, you fill up, and you can just drive. It's basically, if you didn't know it was hydrogen, you wouldn't be able to tell. It's extremely similar and extremely user-friendly. And then there's also an added benefit, which is extremely unique, that hydrogen fuel cells actually intake CO2 out of the air and output O2. So basically by driving a hydrogen fuel cell vehicle, you are literally cleaning the air as you drive. So anyway, those are some brief points on why I believe currently right now electric cars are already, or alternative fuel vehicles are already viable options, and with time I think it's important that we commit more to those options.
Okay, the proposition's clear, the contents are previewed pretty well. The question of viability, I think your definition is okay, but I do think that the respondent is going to have some challenges on what viability means, and the fact that the cars work doesn't necessarily mean that they are economically viable, practically viable, and some of the technology issues that you seem to admit at one point do exist still need to be resolved. So that's probably where most of the dispute is on this particular subject. In the body of the speech, you signpost the secondary points reasonably well, although your first point is not really stated as a claim, it's just a subject area. I'm not sure what inference I'm supposed to be making about fossil fuels. By the end, I guess the inference is that fossil fuels are eventually going to be exhausted, which would justify a need for having these alternative fuel vehicles. And the second point on talks about the electric cars that are on the market today. You've got some examples that you mentioned, but you don't give us any data on those examples, how effective they are, how widespread they are, how viable they are. This is the stuff that I think you need to do a lot more of on this particular speech, arguing that we have infrastructure that's going to accommodate them. I mean, when you get to the hydrogen fuel vehicle, there's some acknowledgement that there are some limitations. The electric cars, you suggest that there aren't really any limitations on accessing and using electric cars, and I think that if that's the case, if If they are just as cheap, if they are just as easy to function, if we have access to the plug-and-play kind of activity, then they should be, it would make sense that economically they would be selling as much in the marketplace as other things are. So there's got to be an explanation as to why that isn't the case. Maybe people are hidebound to traditions, or maybe they have false assumptions about how electric cars work, something along those lines. And that would have been, I think, maybe the thing to develop in that particular point. You usually have some good information on the subjects. Inferences from those informations need to be a little bit more consistent. You're suggesting that we're going to run out of fossil fuels in about 65 years. That is a good chunk of time. I'm not exactly sure if we're already, like you say, on the brink of having these alternative fuel vehicles. Why we have to worry about the future of fossil fuels is not clear to me. The argument that you're making on the third point concerning electricity coming from fossil fuel generated plants, you say there's a net trade-off. We need to have some data on that net trade-off. The hydrogen fuel vehicles are almost out of time. It's basically, the speech does go a little long, so that's a problem. It's almost 2 minutes over, so you need to, hone it down and condense it a bit. All right, thank you. Speaking of honing down.